My name's Jessica Wolfendale. With my colleague Matthew Talbert, we are co-authors of a project on war crimes, causes, excuses and blame. So what we're going to do today is talk about some of the issues that we cover in the project. My research background is in political violence. In particular, I've been interested in the moral psychology of political violence. So one of the things that drew me to this research topic was the question of how it is people come to see war crimes, or what we see as war crimes, as being morally permissible or even morally required. And so that's one of my long-standing research interests. Matt?
So my name's Matthew Talbert. I'm interested in research terms. I'm interested in ethics and moral responsibility, philosophy of agency. I work on the psychological conditions of moral responsibility, the kinds of capacities and powers that agents need to have in order to be appropriate targets for negative reactive attitudes like resentment and indignation. I was interested in thinking about the moral responsibility status of psychopaths, and I did some work on that, which was Jessica suggested related to some of her interests in the in the causes and outcomes of war crimes, and so we decided to combine our research in a particular way. Do you want to add anything to that, Jess, before I...
No, I think that's sufficient. I mean, we'll talk more about our research
Okay.
during the course of our discussion. Just to point out, we're both associate professors at West Virginia
Right.
University, and I'd like to start...
And we're just down the hall from each other at the moment,
That's right.
which is different
We'd
from...
like to thank the Templeton Foundation and the Character Project too for funding our research project and making it possible. So I'll tell you a little bit about the project now. So basically our project's addressing a number of different questions, which we'll elaborate on in more detail as we talk. So one of the questions is, why do war crimes occur, right? So sort of, given that war crimes are unequivocally banned in international law, and so many military forces around the world are committed to these prohibitions of war crimes, it's a sort of continuing question is, well, how is it that we still have genocides and killings of civilians and rape as a tool of war? What is it that leads people to commit these kinds of crimes? So that's one of the questions that we explore in our project. And then a related question is whether and under what conditions perpetrators of war crimes should be held responsible for their actions. And the final issues, which we won't talk about much today, they're the ones that we're currently developing, are the implications of our view for example, legal responsibility of soldiers who are charged with war crimes, and as well as sort of questions about whether, could there be changes to military training to try and prevent war crimes in the future. So that's the very broad questions that we're looking at in our project today. Matt?
So maybe one thing that we should note is that this setup is a little bit different from what other people who are working under the auspices of the Character Project are doing. I think what the other authors did was that one would interview the other and then vice versa. But we decided that since we're two people working on the same project, we could just sort of conversationally elaborate some of the main themes of our project. So I think, Jess, you were going to start by talking about some of the views on the causes of war crimes that we're drawing on.
As I mentioned earlier, my research has been on, for example, specifically on torture. So I did my dissertation, for example, on military torture. How is it that military forces supposedly committed to protection of human rights end up being involved in torture? So when we first started doing research for this project and looking at war crimes more generally, one of the theories that we first sort of looked at was a theory of war crimes that draws on a body of research in social psychology, which is broadly called situationism. And that word is used to describe a number of different views. So Matt will clarify in a bit more detail what version of situationism we were interested in. So this sort of situationist account of war crimes very broadly holds that war crimes occur because military personnel are subjected to a number of external situational forces that lead them to perform actions they wouldn't otherwise perform. So these might include things such as peer pressure, stress, fatigue, fear, as well as being exposed to forces such as ideological propaganda, dehumanizing propaganda that lead them to see potential victims of war crimes as being less than human. So that's roughly what the situationist account holds. But I'll turn over to Matt now, and he'll explain in more detail the social psychology research that's supposed to support that view of war crimes.
Right. So there's this really rich tradition in social psychology. The most famous examples, and maybe well known to many viewers, are the experiments starting in 1961. Stanley Milgram at Yale University, his experiments on obedience, and he was. My understanding is he was inspired by the Nazi atrocities in the Holocaust.
Maybe not inspired. He was
it was. That's what piqued his interest, or at least is one of the things that initially he wondered how it is that you could get people to carry out these orders. How difficult must it have been to get ordinary Germans, perhaps, to do these things that strike us as unconscionable? And one of the things that he found was that it was apparently surprisingly easy through the application of non-coercive pressure, simply telling somebody to do something from your perspective as an authority figure was often enough to get them to do these things that strike us as barbaric or beyond the pale. In the setup of his experiment, he was getting one person to apply a painful shock to another person over that second person's protests. And all that was required in many cases was just informing the person that this is what the experiment required of them. They just had to give these shocks, and they would continue to do this. Now, the shocks weren't real. Nobody was actually tortured in these experiments, but apparently the people who were delivering the shocks thought that they were real, and they didn't want to do it in some sense. They felt that it was wrong, but the pressure that was applied to them, which was very mild, was enough to, for one reason or another, get them to overcome whatever misgivings they had toward giving the shocks. In 1971, there's Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiments, in which he collects a number of undergraduate male Stanford University students, and some of them might have been simply from the town of Stanford, but he puts them in what he calls a functional representation of a prison. He divides them up into prisoners and guards, and then sort of lets them go at one another, and to his surprise, they take on the persona in ways that led them to sadistic behavior. The guards in particular began to mistreat the prisoners in various ways. And the experiment was supposed to run for a couple weeks, but it had to be shut down, Zimbardo thought, pretty quickly. And he thinks that when you put people in the prison environment, that's just an intrinsically destabilizing environment, and it draws this behavior out of people who didn't have any antecedent or characterological dispositions toward that behavior. And Zimbardo draws a lot of connections between that and the atrocities committed by U.S. Army reservists at Abu Ghraib in Iraq recently. So that's just a little bit of the background that a lot of social psychologists have drawn on, and more recently philosophers have become interested in this. And probably the most famous philosopher to have been influenced by this empirical research is John Doris, and in particular his great book, Lack of Character. And Doris says, well, look at all this research. It really seems to undermine some of our conceptions about the relationship between behavior and moral character. Maybe character is less important in allowing us to explain and predict behavior than our situational influences that people are exposed to. And Doris argues that this is problematic for a lot of ethical theory that relies on a robust notion of moral character. And then he says some things about moral responsibility in that book as well. And then later, with Dominic Murphy and his paper from My Lie, their paper From My Lie to Abu Ghraib, they argue that it might be that war crimes are often explained by situational factors. In particular, factors, and I guess we'll make some distinctions later on, Jess, but the basic idea is that there might be many situational factors that allow soldiers to come to believe that impermissible behavior, bad behavior, war crimes, are in fact permissible. And so if these situational factors explain why soldiers come to have this belief about the permissibility of their behavior, then maybe it's unreasonable to blame them for acting on the belief that their behavior is permissible. They don't think they're doing anything wrong, and if the reason they don't think they're doing anything wrong is because they were subjected to these situational forces that they didn't have any control over, then maybe it's unfair to blame them. So with respect to the issue of responsibility, a lot of our work is aimed at pushing back against that fairly plausible thesis that Doris and Murphy elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very intuitively appealing both about their explanation of why war crimes occur and about the implications of that for responsibility. So one of our tasks is in some ways to kind of actually look a bit more closely at the situationist account of war crimes that Doris and Murphy endorse, which is also endorsed by Philip Zimbardo and a number of other authors. And what's intriguing about Doris and Murphy's account is that it looks like it explains not just sort of what we might call heat of battle crimes, which perhaps do seem to be the product of extreme fear and stress on the battlefield. You've seen your comrade killed in front of you out of, immediate desire for revenge. You kill someone, you kill a prisoner. Their account obviously gives an explanation for those kinds of war crimes, but their account also tries to explain what we might call institutional war crimes, such as institutionalized torture, war crimes such as genocide that involve a high degree of organisation, bureaucracy, the participation of many, many people, the authorisation of the military hierarchy and political authorities. In their view, what explains those kinds of war crimes is not so much these sort of combat situational forces, but what they call distal situational forces. So pressures that are exerted sort of over time on soldiers that change their moral reasoning or the way they morally evaluate those actions. So the idea is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, exposure to things like ideology, processes such as obedience to authority can combine to lead soldiers to genuinely believe that torture, say, is the right thing to do. And that, again, raises serious questions about, or seems to raise serious questions about the responsibility, the fairness of blaming soldiers then.
Right.
Particularly if it's not their fault they've been subjected to these external influences that shape their moral evaluation of actions such as torture and genocide.
Right, and so that's an important contrast, the heat of battle forces and then the distal forces. And we're willing to agree that both of those kinds of pressures exist. Clearly, as you said, you've just seen your friend killed. You're like in World War I. You're living in a trench around dead bodies and mustard gas attacks for months on end. That's a stressor that can often count as an excuse. And so we grant that to Doris and Murphy. But what we want to focus on are these distal pressures, these aspects of being inculcated into martial culture, and it's not so clear to us that excuses. We do grant that those pressures can lead somebody, and maybe reasonably, it may be subjectively reasonable for somebody to come to believe that bad behavior is permissible once they've been exposed to these distal situational pressures. But it's another question whether or not, just because they reasonably believe that they behave permissibly, whether or not they are in fact excused, and on our account they're not.
So our critique of views like Doris and Murphy sometimes takes two lines of attack. So our first line of attack is to actually critique their explanation of war crimes. And our critique doesn't necessarily, challenge their claim that these pressures exist or that they are external to some extent. We can accept that. Our critique focuses both on a couple of problems that situationist accounts of war crimes have. So one of the main problems that situationist accounts like Doris and Murphy's have is explaining the really quite significant differences in perpetrators' attitudes towards their own actions and the way and the enthusiasm with which they engage with those actions. So I think it was the psychologist Thomas Glass who referred to this as the smile problem, which is that sometimes there are perpetrators who seem to embrace the opportunity to torture or kill, and in some ways go above and beyond what was required or ordered of them. And then you have other perpetrators who, while they might engage in these war crimes, do so much more reluctantly, feel significant amounts of regret and remorse, and view their own roles very differently. So the problem for the situation account with this is that often it's the perpetrators who have been exposed to essentially the same external forces. So if that's true, how do we get these really quite significant differences in perpetrator attitudes and behaviours? So that's one of the main reasons we think there's a problem with the causal explanation offered by the situation account. And our second line of attack is to focus on the question about responsibility. So in a little while we'll talk more about what our account of responsibility is, but our account is as Matt just said, that we do accept that these external pressures exist and that someone might reasonably believe, for example, that torture is right, but we're going to deny that that gives a reason to withhold blame from that person. But I think what we want to do now is perhaps talk a little bit about our alternative account of the causes of war crimes, the dispositional account. So I'll start off by just introducing the framework with which we're working in our dispositional view. So we drew on some material also from social psychology, but a very different view of personality called the cognitive affective personality system. So under this view of personality, which is difficult to summarise actually shortly, but basically the basic idea is that the idea that there is a difference between the situation and the person is itself fundamentally misguided. So in CAPS theory, and CAPS theory was first developed, I should say, by Walter Mischel in the late 60s, early 1970s, and he then developed and enhanced his theory with his colleagues over the next 30 years. So basically, according to CAPS theory, personality is a combination of sort of interaction between an individual's personal history, beliefs, values, attitudes, and the situations in which they act. But the central idea here, and I think the one that we'll focus on, at least in the context of this video, is construal. So the idea is that you can't really understand what a situation is until you understand what meaning that situation has for the agents acting within the situation. So, for example, we can't just say, oh, that's a situation requiring virtue of honesty. We can't just say that merely by looking at the objective features of the situation, say that there's money lying on the table. It will only be true that it's a situation requiring honesty if we understand that the person acting in that situation construes the situation in that way. And so, in that sense, the idea that you can objectively label what a situation is, independently from understanding the agent's perspectives who are acting in that situation, is just, in according to CAPS theory, just misguided. Right. It's simply false.
We need to pay attention to the construal that the agent brings to the situation.
Exactly. How agents construe the meaning of the situation, how that construal interacts with, reinforces certain of their pre-existing beliefs, values, goals, self-conception, and so forth. So Matt, maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference between CAPS character traits and traditional ideas of character traits. That might be helpful, I think.
Yeah, so I guess the traditional, a more traditional view of character traits is that these are robust and stable dispositions to behave in characteristic ways across a wide variety of situations, so that we can rely on the courageous person to display courage, not just physical courage on the battlefield, but maybe we think that if they're courageous, then they'll also have moral courage, they'll also have the courage of their convictions, and we can rely on them across this wide variety of situations, and that if we, and that's one of the things that Doris's work, or the way that he interprets the work from social psychology, that's one of the things that he calls into question. Maybe we shouldn't be looking for character traits that are anything like those robust and stable and broad dispositions. Maybe there's something else. And the CAPS traits approach to thinking about personality is really different from that, because it doesn't presuppose that we're going to find that kind of broad cross-situational stability without paying attention to the way that the agent conceptualizes the situation that she's in. And
right.
Maybe what looks like uncharacteristic or inconsistent behavior can be revealed to be consistent with a person's personality once we understand that, she believes that is a situation that requires or calls for the virtue of honesty.
So here's an example I think which might be helpful. An example that we use in the chapter actually that we submitted for the edited collection that the Character Project is producing. So we can imagine someone who, due to some traumatic childhood incident, the details of which we need to know, suppose they just don't like people in uniforms, right? So this person, whenever they see someone in a uniform, and this goes for firefighters, police officers, military personnel, anytime they see someone in a uniform, they always turn and try and avoid them. They run away, they get upset. It might be difficult for an external observer to understand or see that behaviour as representing consistency in that person's character. From the outside, we just have someone who seems to randomly run away from firefighters, but also policemen and also perhaps, school crossing guards and people who don't see. There doesn't seem to be anything connecting all of those powerful people in uniform together. So from the outside, it's going to look like this person's behaviour doesn't come from any kind of consistent character trait. But once we understand what this person interprets people in uniform to mean, perhaps as a result of traumatic experience, maybe she sees him as being a threat, then we can see how her behaviour is actually coming from a consistent and stable across time and stable across apparently different situations. And so we can understand, once we understand her psychology and her history, we can see how her behaviour actually does represent a stable dispositional habit or trait.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I don't know if that helps clarify the difference here.
It does for me.
Sorry?
It does for me.
Oh, that's good. That's a good place to start. So what's interesting about CAPS for us is that it allows us a really interesting way of thinking about, well, maybe this provides a good framework for thinking about war crimes, right? Seeing war crimes as being a product not of, pre-existing broad character traits in the kind of traditional character theory sense, but also not just a result of these external forces pushing soldiers around. Instead, we want to try and look at war crimes as resulting from an interaction between these external situations in which soldiers act, but also as soldiers imparting meaning to these situations.
Mm-hmm.
So the way soldiers behave in situations is a product of their own personal and unique individual histories, values, evaluative judgments, and so forth, and these situational factors in which they're acting.
Yeah, so
we thought that was a very useful framework through which to look at war crimes.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize one of the last things you said. So it's different.
Okay.
The CAPS approach is different, not only from traditional or Aristotelian conceptions of character, but also very different from this view that you sometimes think is implicit in some of the literature that one reads, where the situation is just totally external and alien to the agent, and is pushing, as you said, pushing the agent around. And that would make it easier to see why moral responsibility is undermined. But that also seems to be an inaccurate way of reading the self-reports of people who commit war crimes. They are, as you put it there, and you can... we cite the person who calls them meaning makers.
Right.
We're contributing something to the situation by reading meaning into it and by taking meaning out of it.
That's meaning for us, given our own particular sort of self-conceptions and goals. And I think the situationist account fails to grasp that aspect of war crimes, that soldiers are agents. They're active meaning makers. They're creating meaning out of the situations in which they act. They're bringing meaning to them, and that comes from their unique perspectives. They're not just, the reasons and beliefs that they have are not just sort of implanted in them by military culture and training, which sometimes seems to be what is suggested by some of the situationist crimes.
And that contribution that's made, or at least can be made by combatants, soldiers, is going to be sort of foothold for our account of moral responsibility.
I'll just illustrate this with some examples that will make this clearer, I think. So we came across a paper which had some wonderful examples of perpetrator testimony, and this is particularly useful because this is perpetrators writing at the time of their crimes in journals and letters. So one of the issues with understanding how perpetrators think is that often, say, witness testimony for trials is produced for a particular reason and is typically self-serving, of course. So we came across these letters and diaries that were written by two German soldiers, both of whom were involved in the Einsatzgruppen. So these were the small squads of soldiers whose task it was, among other things, to round up and shoot Jews in occupied Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. So the first soldier who we looked at, Felix Landau. So Felix Landau was in an Einsatzkommando unit. He was involved in carrying out mass killings. But what's revealed from his diary is that he doesn't seem to be someone who's motivated by racial hatred. He never speaks of the Jews that he kills in a dehumanising way. And actually some of the things he says about the people he kills are quite insightful and seem to display some kind of empathy. Yet he kind of describes what he's doing as essentially just a job. So he sees it as his job to carry out his orders. He sees it, he takes pride in his hard work. So he writes in his diary that everybody admires his work, and that seems to be very important to him. And the word work is used frequently in his diary. And he criticises other soldiers who are shooting too enthusiastically. So for him, he saw his role as like, I'm a good soldier, I carry out my task, I do it professionally, I'm not like a crazy sadist, I don't go over and above what I need to do, I don't take enjoyment with it, but I don't really, spend time worrying about the morality of what I do. That seemed to be the way he understood his actions. And in contrast was a man called Karl Kretschmer, who was originally a pharmacist who also was in one of the Einsatzkommando units involved in mass shootings. Now, Kretschmer is interesting because his letters to his family reveal that he saw his actions as part of a form of national self-defense. So he totally bought into the Nazis' portrayal of the genocide as a war, so the Jews were enemies, but as a war that was necessary to protect the very existence of the German people. And that's a phrase he actually used in his letters to his family. He says, my comrades and I are fighting for the existence of the German people. But unlike Landau, he finds the act of killing extremely distressing. So for him, because he sees what he's doing as essential and as protecting the life of the German people, he actually sees his goal as becoming more used to killing, as learning how to kill, as overcoming his reluctance to kill. And what's I think interesting about those two cases is that these are two people exposed to very similar situational forces, same kind of training, same kind of culture, who interpreted the meaning of their actions in really quite significantly different ways, in ways that affected how they carried out what they did. And so that's a kind of just a small example of what our account is suggesting, that to understand how people become involved in war crimes, you have to understand what it means to them.
Mm-hmm. Right. That it's not just a question of what they are bringing to the situation or what the situation is imposing on them, but it's going to be some
how
kind
they make sense of it and how it makes sense in them in terms of their self-conception. Right. Landau's conception of himself as a good, honest worker, and Kretschmer's conception of himself as protecting the continued life of the German people. It made a very big difference to how they acted and how they thought about what they did.
Okay, so we're turning now, I think, to the issue of responsibility.
So let's talk about this. I'll introduce us to the.
Okay. So we talked about this a little bit, but you might start by thinking, well, people who commit war crimes, assuming that they behave voluntarily or knowingly and willingly, they're clearly morally responsible and they're clearly blameworthy for what they do. In fact, though, there's some arguments that we think need to be taken seriously for the contrary conclusion, the conclusion that maybe people who commit war crimes are often not blameworthy. Doris and Murphy, as we said, argued that soldiers may reasonably come to believe, because they've been exposed to these situational pressures that they couldn't be expected to withstand or to have foreseen, they come to reasonably believe that the behavior that they're committing is permissible. And a lot of philosophers, not many philosophers talk about war crimes, and not too many talk about situationism, but a lot of philosophers who believe that if you reasonably believe that what you're doing is permissible, then even if it's wrong to do that thing, it's unfair to blame you for doing it. So it's only fair to blame you for doing something that you reasonably could have been expected to know is wrong. So if you accept Doris and Murphy's premise that some soldiers reasonably come to regard, because of situational pressures, reasonably come to regard their bad behavior as permissible, and you also have this view about blame, that you can only be blamed for doing what you could be expected to avoid, if you put those two things together, then you ought to agree with them that many soldiers are not morally responsible for their bad behavior. Now we want to agree that many soldiers may regard their bad behavior as permissible, and it may even be reasonable subjectively for them to do so given the environment that they find themselves in, the forces to which they've been exposed, the kind of meaning that they make out of the environment in which they find themselves. So it may be reasonable for them to believe that they're behaving permissibly, but we think that in itself isn't an excuse. So isn't going to make blaming responses inappropriate, because ultimately the question of blameworthiness is going to be the question of whether or not it's reasonable to respond to a wrongdoer with a certain set of emotional responses, primarily emotional responses. And resentment is the the emotion that most often gets invoked in this context. So the question is it reasonable to respond with resentment to the way that that person's been treated? And that's going to be a function of the significance that that action has for the person. So when we ask, is it reasonable for this person to respond with blame, to respond with resentment? The question is, well, was it reasonable for her to take that behavior, the mistreatment that she's been dealt? Was it reasonable for her to take that as a basis for resentment? And we think that the fact that a wrongdoer, the fact that somebody who commits a war crime, the fact that a torturer regards it as permissible to treat his victim in the way that he does, doesn't do anything to change the significance of that action for the agent. The torturer treats his victim with disdain, with ill will, at least with lack of sufficient regard, regardless of whether or not he thinks torture is permissible. And one of the things that we argue is that, in fact, the torturer's regarding his actions as permissible is probably best thought of as constituted by a sort of ill will or lack of appropriate regard.
Yeah, the torturer thinks that it's okay for me to torture you because you are contemptible,
right,
because you are less than fully human or somehow torturable.
Right.
So, yeah, the belief that torture is okay seems to include the belief that torture victims are torturable.
Torturable. They're available for this kind of treatment.
That's right.
And so the fact that the torturer is really, really sincerely committed to that perspective doesn't do anything to make it less expressive of ill will, of the sort of things that ground blaming responses. So it's not as if we should expect the victim to take the torturer's sincere profession of his commitment to his line of work, his sincerely held belief that the torturer is open to that kind of treatment as an excuse. There's nothing about that account that the torturer might offer that makes it so that the victim should call off the negative reactive attitudes that constitute blame.
I mean, there are cases where we think, well, blame isn't appropriate, but typically those cases are cases where we realise that the person who's hurt us did so accidentally, didn't realise that they were hurting us, but acted out of ignorance. But in those two cases, I mean, the reason why we think those cases are cases where blame is inappropriate is because there precisely isn't an attitude of contempt or disdain for the person who's been hurt.
Yeah.
If you hurt me accidentally, you didn't set out to hurt me, you didn't want to hurt me, you didn't desire that I suffer. And that's what makes blame inappropriate. But the torturer, and this again is part of what it means to be a torturer, desires and intends that the victim suffer.
Right.
That's why he is a torturer. You can't accidentally torture someone. And so for us, what makes blame appropriate for the victim is that the torturer's actions are deliberately manifesting an attitude that warrants blame. Right? There's nothing about there's nothing about the way the torturer's beliefs were formed that gives the victim a reason to withhold blame.
Now you could say, well, the torturer is ignorant of what he's doing. And in some cases, ignorance does count as an excuse. But the kind of ignorance that the torturer displays is not the kind of ignorance that generally tends to excuse you. He's not unaware of the consequences of his actions. He knows that he's hurting the person.
That's the point.
He's unaware that it's wrong to hurt the person. And we think that that kind of pure moral ignorance, even if it's not the person's fault that he has that moral ignorance, that kind of pure moral ignorance doesn't excuse because it does nothing to call into question the ill will that's expressed through the behavior. As a matter of fact, you might think that it aggravates ill will or contempt. The torturer's moral ignorance is constituted, you might think, by the fact that he regards that person as available for that sort of treatment.
That's right.
Which is to say, his ignorance is just a function of the fact that he thinks or that he's oriented towards that person in a bad way.
That's right. And I think one of the things I think that our personal responsibility, or what advantage it has, and something that's been mentioned in community accounts, is that, think about what it says to the victim of a war crime. To say to them, oh, look, the person who raped you, and, rape has been used as a deliberate tactic in war frequently. So imagine if we have to say to a victim of rape, systematic rape in war, that, well, look, the people who raped you, they honestly believe that this was a permissible thing to do because of the way they've been indoctrinated and so forth. So, you, the victim of this awful rape, you can't blame the rapist. And we think that's really objectionable to say to victims that it's inappropriate for them to blame someone who deliberately and intentionally harmed them in such a profound way. In essence, it asks the victim to accept the perpetrator's moral evaluation of what went on.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying to the victim, oh, well, the perpetrator thought it was okay, and you should accept that characterization in some sense.
Right.
You have to say, well, normally I would object to being treated this way, but because he thought it was okay, I can't blame him.
Right.
That just seems fundamentally wrong and highly disrespectful to the victims of war crimes to boot. Yes.
And in fact, at least insofar as we accept the victim's own assessment of her moral standing to object, then we ought to agree that her blame is permissible. We disagree with the assessment of the victimizer. We agree with the assessment of the victim. We see that as there's a moral disagreement between these two about whether or not the behavior was permissible. But since we side with the victim, it seems that we ought to see her blaming responses as licensed, as a form of reasonable protest against the way that she was treated.
Yeah. Just a qualification. I mean, we're not saying that victims always do actively feel blame or do feel resentment. I think that it's appropriate for them to do so. I mean, obviously there are cases where victims, for many reasons, might even feel like they deserve the way they're treated. Right? It's possible that there are victims who have been abused for so long or have been subject to their own propaganda as well, and they might think, well, maybe I deserve to be tortured or raped. So we're not saying that it's the case that victims always consciously think I've been treated wrongly. Our point is that it is reasonable for them to think so. It would be reasonable. It would be appropriate for them. And in fact, one of the reasons why we do generally think that victims who blame themselves, we think that they're wrong. They shouldn't blame themselves. And in a sense, that intuition that victims who blame themselves are mistaken, it supports our view, right? That of course they should blame the person who harms them.
Yeah.
So I think that's just a worth a point.
Right. That's important. There are a lot of complications. We probably don't have time to get into them, but there are cases of justifiability. I mean, one way you can excuse yourself from blame is to show that your action was justified. Sometimes really bad behavior is in fact justified, but we think that the test of justifiability is going to have to be, well, is it reasonable to expect the victim to accept that as a justification?
Right, or could they accept it? Could we say, ideally, I mean, think about classic cases of self-defense. If I attack you with an axe, which I do, suppose I'm, suffering from some delusion, I attack you with an axe, and you shoot me in the leg to stop me. Now, you've intentionally and deliberately harmed me, so it might seem on the surface that I can blame you, but we might think, well, when I'm rational again and not suffering this delusion, I'll agree that it was justifiable for you to shoot me in the leg to stop me from killing you.
Right.
There's a sense in which we could imagine hypothetical agreement between both parties about the permissibility of using force. That your intention, and also you're attacking me in that way, just doesn't seem to be malevolent in the way that torture and killing of civilians and military rape are clearly intentionally malevolent. Right. So there's another way I think we can distinguish some kinds of justifiable harming.
So that's thinking about. There are all these complications that we can't get into, but the basic idea is that simply viewing your behavior as permissible, and even it being reasonable for you to view your behavior as permissible, does not itself show that the behavior lacks the kind of significance to which blaming responses are appropriate.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that all people who commit war crimes are blameworthy. There are sometimes a war crime could be justified. It's at least theoretically possible that we would judge that it was justified to commit this what seemed like a terrible act.
And it may well be that heated battle crimes, perhaps.
Right.
Some of them might be excused.
Yeah, they're not justified, but they're excused for other reasons.
Extreme emotional distress. Someone's actions are not really representative of their attitudes.
Right. But merely citing situational, and this may be a good way to wrap things up because it's going to bring it back to the CAPS trait. Merely citing the role that situational factors played isn't enough to show that the behavior wasn't expressive of the agent's values or the agent's orientation toward the other person. And that's going to be enough to get the blaming responses on the table.
The CAPS theory kind of marries quite nicely with that view of responsibility as well.
Right.
Because in the CAPS view, a person's behaviour...
And you could have them separately. You could have just the view of responsibility.
You could support or critique of your responsibility and accept our CAT's dispositional kind of war crimes, or you could disagree with the dispositional kind of war crimes to accept over your responsibility. But we think actually they mesh together quite well because of the CAPS emphasis, the CAPS theory with its emphasis on an agent's behaviour flowing from their own self-conceptions and goals and attitudes fits with the idea that a person's actions, even when committed in the context of war crimes, are expressive of that person's evaluative judgments and beliefs. And that person has, in a sense, contributed to the formation, has actively been part of the formation of those beliefs and actions in a way that makes them meaningful to that person. So in a sense, the war criminal is an agent, an active agent who created meaning out of what they were doing, and that does, I think, give force to the idea that their actions express attitudes for which we can hold them accountable, regardless of the other forces that influence their beliefs.
Right. So we're at about 43 minutes now. Do we want to say anything about prevention?
I think just a couple of final notes. I mean, I think that our view does have implications both for theories of legal responsibility for war crimes, although that's not something we actually went into in a lot of detail just due to lack of space. I mean, certainly some of the legal excuses that perhaps have been considered to apply to war criminals would not apply in our case. At least in some war crimes trials, the fact that someone thought something was permissible has been put forward as an excusing condition, and clearly in our view would problematise that kind of legal excuse. In terms of prevention, I mean, I think what's revealing and I think what's intriguing as a possible avenue for further research is that, well, clearly we can't just whack more ethics classes into military training, because one of the things that our account of war crimes reveals is how easy it is for ethical concepts, and as well as concepts such as military virtues like loyalty and honour, can become, I guess, perverted to provide support for war crimes, to provide support for the very things which you might think those principles and virtues should guard against. So, of course, Eichmann notoriously referred to Kant, to Kantian ethics in his trial, and defended his actions by appeal to the categorical imperative. And, but his understanding of the categorical imperative was filtered through this, what David Velleman calls social articulation of morality. So the principles of Kantian ethics were filtered through different kind of empirical beliefs about the status of the races and so forth. And so you ended up with a view which was like, I'm a Kantian, but the principle of respect, for example, doesn't apply to Jews. Right. So, I think what that suggests is that both that we have to teach military personnel more about the processes by which war crimes can come to be seen as permissible. And I think that would help them perhaps guard against processes within the military that tend to adopt the language of, say, virtues to
yeah. I mean, but obviously adopting that language is really important for military organizations to achieve their goals. So, I mean, it may be that in the end we just can't be too sanguine about a military organization that achieves its goals and also cannot create a context that promotes...
that views killing civilians as part of what it is to be honourable, for example. Yeah, I mean, that's a real dilemma. I'm not sure what the answer is. But I think at least our account certainly raises problems with some current methods that are being used to train soldiers to be ethical.
All right. Well, shall we thank the Character Project and the Templeton Foundation again, I suppose?
Yes.
We should do that. All right. So I'm just going to stop the recorder.
Okay. Thank you.